You think medieval people were prudes. You imagine monks whispering prayers in stone abbeys, peasants too exhausted to think about anything but bread, knights and ladies who never touched until marriage. Maybe you even believe the old myth that they did it through a hole in a sheet. But history doesn't forgive lies. The truth is far darker, far stranger, and far more humiliating. Medieval sexuality wasn't private. It was a public spectacle, weaponized by church, kings, and communities to control, humiliate, and exploit. Your body wasn't yours. Your pleasure wasn't yours. And your marriage? That was a contract, policed by priests, notaries, crowds. Forget romance, forget privacy, forget choice. Because in the medieval world, your most intimate moments were turned into theater. Your performance was judged in courtrooms. Your failures could be punished with ruin, exile, or death. This is the story of the Forbidden Chambers. A story that exposes what really happened behind the stone walls of castles, the wooden doors of peasant huts, and the velvet curtains of royal palaces. A story so disturbing it makes modern scandals look like playground gossip. The fitness trials. When intimacy was a court case. Picture this. York, 1370. A man named John Sanderson stands trembling in the middle of a courtroom. His crime? His wife claims their marriage has not been consummated. In a world where marriage was an economic contract, consummation wasn't just sex. It was proof that the contract was valid. No consummation meant annulment. No annulment meant dowries returned, inheritances disrupted, alliances broken. So the court had one job: decide whether John was fit. Certified examiners entered the chamber. Midwives, physicians, even clergy all summoned to investigate a man's most private ability. The doors locked, the crowd waited in, silence. And then, before judges and scribes, John was stripped and examined. Every response, every tremor, every failure was written down in official records. His dignity evaporated. His body became public property. And John Sanderson wasn't unique. Court records across Europe reveal dozens of such trials every decade. Walter Deontay, tried 3 times in 1292, failed each one despite desperate herbal remedies. Pierre de Franville in Paris nearly killed himself with dangerous aphrodisiacs before finally passing on his 3rd attempt. For these men, failure didn't just mean humiliation. It meant social annihilation. Medieval justice didn't care about privacy. It cared about public proof, and nothing was more horrifying than having to prove your intimate fitness under the cold stare of judges, notaries, and your spouse's family, the witnessed wedding night. But if the fitness trials sound bad, wait until you hear about the wedding night. In 1445, Margaret of Anjou married King Henry VI of England. She was 15. When the time came to consummate the marriage, she wasn't alone. 23 nobles, clergy, and courtiers crowded into the royal bedchamber. Curtains were drawn thin, shadows visible, sounds carefully noted. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the foot of the bed, blessing the act. Without consummation, the marriage wasn't legal. Without witnesses, consummation wasn't proven. Imagine being 15, stripped by relatives, pushed into bed with a stranger, while half your court listens for proof of movement. And then imagine knowing that if you failed, your country could be plunged into war. This wasn't scandal, this was law. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette endured years of humiliating scrutiny as nobles debated whether they had properly consummated their marriage. The Archbishop of Reims literally stood in the room. Their sheets were inspected, their bodies examined. Their failures became international crises. Royal weddings weren't private love stories. They were state trials in bedchambers where young couples' failures could end dynasties. The Church of Hypocrisy. And while priests preached purity from pulpits, bishops in England and France quietly ran massive sex empires. The Bishop of Winchester controlled the largest entertainment district in medieval London. Over 10 women, branded as Winchester geese, worked under his authority. Their bodies were taxed, their wages were skimmed. The prophets built cathedrals where those same bishops condemned lust as a mortal sin. Imagine praying in a church whose bells were paid for by the bodies of women, your bishop, licensed, inspected, and exploited. That wasn't scandal, that was daily life. In Avignon, during the papal exile, the Pope's treasurers collected taxes from church-owned brothels. In Seville, brothels were literally attached to cathedrals by underground tunnels, so priests could slip in unseen. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden, it was institutional. This is what medieval people called moral order. Condemn lust in sermons, profit from it in ledgers. Preach purity on Sunday, count earnings on Monday. The medicine of pleasure. If you think medieval medicine was primitive, think again. Doctors in the 12th century were prescribing female satisfaction as a medical necessity. According to the two-seed theory, conception required both male and female release. If a woman couldn't reach pleasure, she couldn't conceive, which meant husbands were legally and medically obligated to ensure their wives' satisfaction. Physicians taught techniques, midwives coached couples. Manuals described positions, stimulation, even devices carved from ivory and wood. In an age when women today are told their desires were discovered in the 20th century, medieval women had legal grounds to demand satisfaction. If their husbands failed, they could sue for annulment. But of course, there was a twist. The church condemned pleasure for its own sake. So, women were trapped in a paradox. Confess, enjoying too much, you're sinful. Confess, enjoying too little, you're defective. Either way, your body wasn't yours. It belonged to medicine, theology, and law. The deadly contraceptives. And when women wanted to avoid pregnancy, they gambled with their lives. Recipes survive in grimoires and medical texts. Mercury drinks that caused madness. Lead, salts that rotted brains. Crocodile dung mixed with honey and wool, shoved inside the body. Sea sponges soaked in vinegar. Sheep intestines tied with ribbons. Every attempt at contraception carried the risk of poisoning, infection, or death. Yet women use them anyway, because the alternative, endless pregnancies, deadly childbirths, starvation, was worse. One skeleton from a medieval cemetery in London showed lethal levels of lead in her bones. She hadn't been poisoned by accident. She had poisoned herself in the desperate hope of avoiding another pregnancy. The church called these women sinners, but history reveals them as survivors, risking everything to escape a system designed to break them. The potions of the dead. When flowers and chocolates didn't exist, love in the Middle Ages came from recipes written in grimoires, recipes that could make even the most hardened executioner flinch. Forget roses. Medieval women were told to grind bones from unbaptized infants, harvested secretly from graveyards. They were instructed to collect menstrual blood, dry it into cakes, and slip it into a man's wine. They bribed executioners for scraps of organs from freshly hanged criminals. These weren't fairy tale witches hiding in forests. These were ordinary women, desperate in a world where marriage determined survival. Love potions weren't about passion, they were about power, inheritance, and escape. In France, 1320, a woman named Beatrice d'Anasol stood trial for slipping her lover her own menstrual blood mixed with honeyed wine. She wasn't accused of murder, she was accused of witchcraft through love. And her punishment wasn't light, she was sentenced to death. The recipes weren't nonsense either. Some had genuine psychoactive effects. Dried blood, mixed with wine, could alter taste and color. Mandrake root and henbane created hallucinations. Mercury-based concoctions made men weak, dizzy, and pliable. The magic wasn't supernatural. It was chemistry, deadly chemistry. The medieval world was so unforgiving that women risked death and damnation just to win affection or secure a husband. The line between healer and witch, between midwife and poisoner, was razor thin. Adultery as public punishment. And what if you broke the sacred bonds of marriage? What if you sought love outside the priest's rigid contracts of dowries and alliances? In southern France, the punishment was la course. The guilty couple, stripped naked, was tied together with a rope, the man at the front, the woman forced to hold the rope like a leash. They were paraded through the streets while the crowd hurled rotten food, mud, and even human waste at them. Merchants closed their shops to watch. Children cheered. Priests rang bells as the adulterers stumbled past. Some towns forced them to run miles, stopping at designated humiliation stations where villagers whipped their bare skin. It wasn't just punishment, it was community theater, a ritual purge of sin, and it didn't always end in survival. Many men died from infection after the ropes cut deep into their flesh. Women were often exiled after the humiliation, branded permanently as unclean. Imagine your worst relationship scandal broadcast on social media. Now, replace the tweets with whips and chamber pots. That was medieval cancel culture, the role of the community. What's shocking to modern audiences is how public all of this was. Today, intimacy is considered private, your bedroom, your business. But in the Middle Ages, intimacy was a community matter. Your neighbors cared, your priests cared, your judges cared. Why? Because intimacy wasn't just about love, it was about economics, inheritance, and politics. A barren marriage meant no heirs, which meant land disputes, broken alliances, civil war. A woman's fidelity wasn't just a matter of personal choice, it was about the purity of bloodlines and the legitimacy of dynasties. That's why the community had the right, the duty to police it, to watch, to judge, to punish. Because your body wasn't yours, it was society's, the paradox of pleasure and sin. Here's where it gets twisted. Medieval medicine insisted that women must experience pleasure in order to conceive. Midwives taught techniques. Physicians prescribed oils, herbs, and devices to encourage release. Husbands were ordered to try harder. At the same time, the church condemned women who admitted enjoying sex as sinful, lustful, even demonic. Priests demanded confessions of excessive pleasure. Women who faked enjoyment were accused of blocking God's plan. Women who enjoyed too much were accused of indulging the devil. So, which was it? The paradox was impossible. Women lived on a knife's edge, pressured to feel punished for feeling. Medieval sexuality was a cage, designed so that no matter what you did, you were guilty. The bishop's brothels. Nothing reveals the hypocrisy of the medieval world more than the bishop's brothels. The Bishop of Winchester didn't just tolerate prostitution in London, he ran it. His coat of arms hung proudly above the doors of brothels in Southwark. Women paid weekly fees to the church. Their bodies funded the very cathedral where sermons condemned them. Records show over 10 women worked under his authority. They were inspected weekly by church doctors for disease. They were taxed on holy days. They were fined if they missed confession. The money was staggering, enough to build new churches, fund wars, and fill treasuries. Every prayer whispered under the vaulted ceiling of Winchester Cathedral was paid for with the suffering of women branded as Winchester geese. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden, it was institutionalized, the shadow of control. Strip away the myths and the comedy, and what you see is control. Every bizarre ritual, every humiliating trial, every deadly potion was about controlling bodies. The state needed heirs, the church needed taxes, families needed alliances, and individuals, men and women, both were crushed beneath those needs. That's why consummation required witnesses. That's why bishops licensed sex work while condemning lust. That's why women drank mercury and men risked humiliation in court. Because intimacy wasn't about love, it was about power. So forget the fairy tales, forget the myths about prudish peasants and pious nobles. The truth is that medieval sexuality wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was dragged into courtrooms, paraded through markets, and preached from pulpits. Your body wasn't yours. Your love wasn't yours. Even your most private moments were, scripted by judges, priests, and mobs. This is just the beginning, because if this first glimpse into the forbidden chambers horrified you, wait until you see how deep the corruption went. Wait until you hear about the rituals that blended medicine with magic, about the priests who preached purity while practicing corruption, about the way desire itself became a battlefield. We've only opened the door. The chamber goes much deeper. The rituals of fertility. If marriage was the foundation of society, fertility was its currency. Without heirs, bloodlines collapsed, dowries were returned, and alliances dissolved, which meant every bedroom was a battlefield, and conception was a matter of state. But what happens when heirs didn't come? When noble brides produced no children? When peasant women's wombs stayed empty despite years of toil? The answer was ritual. In towns from Florence to York, fertility rituals mixed medicine, magic, and humiliation. Women who struggled to conceive were paraded naked around fields while priests sprinkled holy water on their bodies. They were forced to lie on altars while relics were pressed against their stomachs. Some were ordered to drink concoctions of powdered deer antler, rooster blood, or ground pearls. If this sounds like superstition, remember it wasn't just peasants. Queens, duchesses, and noblewomen endured these humiliations. In 1314, Queen Clemence of France underwent a bizarre ritual where monks chanted over her while midwives rubbed her with ointments made of whale oil and herbs. It didn't work. She remained childless, and her reputation was destroyed. Fertility was never private. It was public performance. A woman's failure to conceive wasn't just her shame. It was her family's disgrace, her dynasty's crisis, her kingdom's threat. Priestly prescriptions. And in the shadows of these rituals, priests offered prescriptions that blurred the line between medicine and sin. Some advised women to lie beneath church altars during intercourse, believing the sacred stones would bless conception. Others recommended relics, saints' bones, placed under beds, holy water poured on sheets, consecrated candles lit beside couples as they struggled in the dark. But the most disturbing rituals came from the contradictions of theology itself. The Church insisted that pleasure was sinful unless it was necessary for conception. This paradox forced priests into grotesque positions. Confession manuals from the 14th century reveal priests asking women if they reached satisfaction, not out of concern for their well-being, but because the validity of their marriage might depend on it. One manual even instructed confessors to quiz women on whether they responded appropriately to their husband's advances and whether they felt the release necessary for conception. Imagine kneeling in a confessional, expected to describe your orgasms or lack thereof to a celibate priest who held your soul in his hands. That was medieval spirituality, physicians, and pleasure. The medical world took this even further. Physicians believed that female release was essential, and they prescribed elaborate methods to guarantee it. The Trotula, a famous medieval medical text, included entire chapters on how to ensure women's satisfaction. It recommended oils infused with cinnamon and pepper, massages with heated ointments, and specific positions depending on a woman's humoral constitution. Cold-natured women were told to ride on top. Moist-humored women were instructed to lie sideways. For others, physicians even designed ivory or wooden tools, polished smooth and rubbed with herbs to stimulate arousal. These weren't secret perversions. They were mainstream medical advice taught in universities, written in manuscripts, and copied by monks. But even here, hypocrisy reigned, for while doctors treated female desire as medical necessity, priests condemned it as sin. Women were trapped between science and salvation, damned if they felt too little, damned if they felt too much. The market of love magic. When medicine and prayer failed, people turned to magic. Medieval Europe was a marketplace of spells and charms promising love, desire, and control. Street vendors sold powders said to spark passion, rings inscribed with Latin words of power, amulets containing herbs or animal parts. But the most infamous were love potions. Recipes survive in grimoires and court records, and they read like nightmares. Dried menstrual blood mixed into wine, powdered human bones stolen from graves, organs from freshly executed criminals, dried and ground into dust, doves' brains boiled in milk, amulets made from the reproductive organs of weasels, worn around the thigh. One trial in Venice in 1480 uncovered an entire network of women selling love potions made from graveyard ingredients. They bribed gravediggers for bones, bought organs from executioners, and collected their own blood in secret. And yet, people believed. Husbands drank their wives' concoctions, convinced their sudden attraction was proof of magic. Men reported racing hearts, dizziness, an inability to resist. Some recipes worked not because they were truly magical, but because they poisoned, weakened, and disoriented their victims into submission. Love, in the medieval world, was dangerous. It came from graves, blood, and death, public shaming as punishment. If love potions revealed desperation, adultery revealed the fury of society. As we saw in southern France, adulterers were paraded naked with ropes. But across Europe, variations abounded. In England, adulterers were locked in pillories with signs describing their sins. Crowds spat, beat them, and sometimes mutilated them. In Germany, women accused of adultery had their heads shaved and were tarred, then forced to ride donkeys backward through town. In Italy, couples caught in the act were paraded with horns on their heads, symbols of cuckoldry. These punishments weren't about justice, they were about humiliation. They were about turning intimacy into theatre, about making private failure into public entertainment, and they worked. People feared humiliation more than death. Records show that some accused adulterers killed themselves rather than face the spectacle of public shaming. Intimacy as politics. At the highest levels of power, intimacy became politics. Royal marriages weren't love stories, they were treaties, and consummation wasn't just biology, it was diplomacy. When Catherine of Aragon married Prince Arthur of England in 1501, her wedding night was witnessed by 6 nobles and the Spanish ambassador. The next morning, Arthur bragged he had been in Spain, his crude joke a political declaration. Decades later, that night became central to Henry VIII's annulment trial. Did Catherine consummate with Arthur? Or was she pure when she married Henry? The fate of England's religion hinged on that single question. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's infamous failure to consummate their marriage sparked ridicule across Europe, destabilized the French monarchy, and fueled revolutionary propaganda. Their bedroom performance, or lack thereof, became a political weapon. The body wasn't just personal, it was a kingdom's foundation, the deadly cost of control. Behind every ritual, every trial, every humiliation, there was one truth. People died because of it. Women poisoned themselves with contraceptives. Men died from infections after public shaming rituals. Couples were executed for adultery. Healers and midwives were burned as witches for selling potions. Queens were discarded, exiled, or executed for failing to conceive. Sexuality wasn't private, it was a weapon, it was a battlefield, and ordinary people, peasants, merchants, even nobles were the casualties. The psychology of surveillance. What makes this world so terrifying isn't just the cruelty, it's the surveillance. There was no privacy. Your neighbors watched, your priest interrogated, your judge documented, your sheets were inspected, your body was evidence. The medieval world invented surveillance long before cameras. It was social, religious, and cultural, and it was total. Modern audiences like to believe intimacy is private, but in many ways we've come full circle. Dating apps track our desires, social media exposes our relationships, cancel culture humiliates in public. The tools have changed, the impulse hasn't. So far, we've seen the nightmare of medieval intimacy. Courtrooms turned into theaters of humiliation, priests doubling as brothel managers, physicians prescribing satisfaction while condemning it as sin, and love potions brewed from bones and blood. And this is only the middle layer, because beneath these rituals lies something even darker, a system where sexuality wasn't just controlled, it was commodified, weaponized, and sold, where bishops built empires from desire, where women risked their lives for control, and where kings used beds as battlefields. The forbidden chambers still have deeper doors, and the next time we open them, we'll see how entire empires turned intimacy into politics, profit, and power, beds as battlefields. In the medieval and early modern world, beds weren't just where marriages began, they were where wars ended, treaties were sealed, and dynasties rose or fell. Every royal bedchamber was a battlefield. Kings used their sexual conquests to prove virility, secure alliances, and project power. Queens were judged less for their diplomacy than for their ability to bear heirs. Mistresses became pawns, sometimes more powerful than wives, sometimes executed as scapegoats. Take the case of Isabella of France, married to Edward II of England in 1308. Their marriage, too, was a political alliance, but their bedroom became a scandal. Edward ignored his queen for his male favorites, especially Piers Gaveston. Rumors of neglect, humiliation, and political chaos swirled around the court. Isabella eventually turned against Edward, helping to orchestrate his deposition. His death, allegedly with a red-hot poker inserted into his body, was whispered as poetic justice for his sexual deviance. In this case, sexuality wasn't private gossip, it was propaganda. Chronicles framed Edward's failures in bed as failures in kingship. Intimacy became state policy, the market of flesh. Beyond palaces, sexuality became commerce. Slavery, concubinage, and prostitution blurred into one system of exploitation. The Islamic caliphates, the Ottomans, and Christian kingdoms alike trafficked in human beings as sexual property. Eunuchs guarded harems, castrated in brutal operations that killed most of them. Concubines were taken as children, trained, and displayed as status symbols. In Europe, prostitution was tolerated, regulated, and taxed. Brothels were licensed by cities, inspected by doctors, and often controlled by the church itself. In Southwark, the Bishop of Winchester's Winchester geese were forced to pay taxes on their bodies. They were branded with marks of shame, denied Christian burial, yet their earnings built cathedrals. Records from Avignon show papal treasuries enriched by brothel taxes. Priests owned taverns with backrooms for sex. Cathedrals were decorated with profits from desire. Bodies became commodities measured, bought, sold, and discarded. Rituals of humiliation. But commerce wasn't enough. Communities demanded rituals to enforce morality, and those rituals often crossed into sexual humiliation. In parts of Germany, women accused of gossip or disobedience were forced to wear the scold's bridle, an iron mask with a spiked bit inserted into the mouth. Some versions had bells, so every step announced their shame. Others had carved animal faces, turning women into grotesque beasts paraded through streets. Adulterers were stripped and whipped. Prostitutes caught outside licensed districts were beaten, shaved, and branded. Homosexual men were drowned or burned, sometimes with ritual mockery, forced to dance in women's clothing before execution. These weren't punishments carried out in silence, they were theatre. Whole towns gathered. Musicians played. Children watched. Sexuality became spectacle, both desired and despised. Contradictions of the Church. The greatest irony lay with the Church itself. Clergy preached purity, yet fathered illegitimate children. Monks wrote sermons condemning lust while copying erotic manuscripts. Bishops owned brothels, priests who condemned adultery in confessions, sometimes solicited sex from penitents. The records of church courts are filled with hypocrisy. Priests punished for keeping mistresses, nuns executed for affairs, monasteries exposed as centers of forbidden sexuality. Yet these same institutions enforced the harshest rules on ordinary people. One notorious case, the Bishop of Strasbourg, 15th century, owned 4 brothels within sight of his cathedral. When accused of hypocrisy, he justified it with theology. Better the flock sins here, where I may oversee it, than elsewhere where it might grow worse. Medieval people weren't blind to the corruption. Satirical songs, poems, and plays mocked priests and monks for lust and greed. But criticism changed nothing. The machine of hypocrisy rolled on, fueled by power and profit. The obsession with virginity. If women's sexuality was controlled in life, their virginity became the obsession of death. Noble brides were examined for proof of purity before marriage. Midwives swore oaths that girls were intact. Sheets were inspected after wedding nights for bloodstains. Entire alliances depended on these fragile tokens, and when virginity failed, ruin followed. Women accused of losing it outside marriage faced humiliation, annulment, or execution. Some faked proof with animal blood, some bribed midwives. Some killed themselves rather than face shame. Virginity was treated as property, a political asset to be guarded, verified, and traded, the erotics of violence. Perhaps the darkest truth is that cruelty and sexuality often overlapped. Torture devices targeted sexual organs. Punishments mocked intimacy, public shaming blurred humiliation with desire. The pair of anguish was forced into mouths, vaginas, or rectums, then expanded until flesh tore. The Spanish donkey split bodies through the groin. Impalement turned victims into grotesque symbols of violation. Crowds didn't just watch in horror, they watched with fascination. Chroniclers described laughter, excitement, even arousal in audiences. The line between punishment and pornography blurred until it disappeared. Desire as survival. Yet in this brutal system, some learned to use desire as power. Royal mistresses wielded influence equal to ministers. Courtesans in Renaissance Italy became patrons of art and politics. Some concubines in Ottoman harems, like Hurrem, Sultan, rose from slavery to queenship, manipulating desire to control empires. For these women, sexuality wasn't weakness, it was weapon, but the price was steep: fail to please, and you were discarded, exiled, or executed. By now, the pattern is clear. Sexuality in the medieval and early modern world wasn't hidden. It was exposed, commodified, and weaponized. From the beds of kings to the cages of prostitutes, from church pulpits to torture chambers, intimacy was never private. It was property, it was politics, it was punishment. And if this seems distant, remember this: the obsession with controlling bodies didn't vanish with the Middle Ages. It evolved, it adapted, and in many ways, it still surrounds us. The forbidden chambers aren't just history. They're a mirror, papal beds, and papal lies. If kings turned their beds into battlefields, the popes turned theirs into hypocrisy of biblical proportions. Take Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, officially God's representative on earth. In reality, a man who fathered at least 9 children, kept mistresses openly, and hosted orgiastic banquets inside the Vatican. The infamous Banquet of Chestnuts in 1501, recorded by multiple eyewitnesses, described naked courtesans crawling on all fours to pick up chestnuts, while cardinals and priests judged their bodies. And yet, on Sundays, those same priests preached against lust, adultery, and fornication. The medieval church didn't just fail its own rules, it weaponized them. For ordinary people, failure meant punishment, humiliation, even death. For the clergy, failure meant indulgence, fees, donations, or quiet relocation. The double standard was clear. Lust was sin for the weak, profit for the powerful, the witch's body. By the late Middle Ages, sexuality itself became evidence of witchcraft. Women accused of sorcery were stripped and searched for witches' marks, moles, scars, or birthmarks said to be signs of the devil's kiss. Midwives were targeted, especially accused of using contraception or abortion magic. Every act of female knowledge became suspect. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, the infamous witch-hunting manual, declared that women were more prone to witchcraft because they were insatiable in carnal lust. It claimed witches used sex with demons to gain power, stole men's genitals with magic, and corrupted entire communities through desire. Under torture, women confessed to impossible acts, flying to Sabbaths, copulating with demons, using ointments made from infants' fat. Their sexuality became proof of guilt, their bodies reduced to evidence of damnation. Tens of thousands of women burned at the stake, many after confessing to crimes invented by interrogators obsessed with sex. The witch hunts weren't just about superstition, they were about control of women's bodies, criminalizing knowledge, punishing independence, and branding female sexuality as demonic. Medicine meets magic. Even as the church condemned witches, physicians continued to prescribe treatments that blurred into magic. Infertile couples were told to sleep with amulets of animal organs tied to their bodies. Women were instructed to drink concoctions of wine mixed with crushed gemstones. Men were prescribed diets heavy in oysters, eels, and exotic spices. Herbalists taught women to insert mixtures of honey, acacia, and herbs as contraception. Methods partly effective, partly deadly. Alchemists experimented with mercury, lead, and sulfur, creating dangerous brews passed off as love aids. The line between medicine and magic was invisible. One day's healer was the next day's witch. One recipe written in Latin was called science. The same recipe whispered by a midwife was called sorcery, and both could kill you. rituals of shame. If the witch trials revealed the fear of sexuality, the rituals of everyday shame revealed its social policing. In Italian towns, women accused of promiscuity were forced to wear donkey masks and parade through streets. In Germany, men caught with prostitutes outside licensed zones were flogged while forced to hold candles, symbols of false piety. In England, fornicators were whipped publicly, sometimes tied together naked as townsfolk jeered. Punishment wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Masks, ropes, bells, shaved heads, all designed to mark the guilty as grotesque, animal, or demonic. And always, the community gathered. Merchants paused their trade, children were dragged along, priests blessed the spectacle. These punishments weren't secret corrections, they were public theater, designed to etch fear into the collective mind. Sexuality as terror. What ties all these practices together is simple: terror. The fear of humiliation kept people obedient. The fear of infertility drove women to poisons. The fear of witchcraft destroyed midwives' knowledge. The fear of scandal shaped kings' marriages. Sexuality was controlled not just with chains and laws, but with fear. Fear of exposure, fear of failure, fear of being branded unfit, impure, or possessed. In this way, medieval sexuality wasn't just personal, it was political. It kept peasants submissive, nobles bound, and women silenced. The strange privilege of courtesans. Yet in the middle of all this control, some women flipped the script. Courtesans in Renaissance Italy lived lives both scandalous and powerful. Educated, eloquent, and trained in seduction, they entertained kings, dukes, and cardinals. Some became patrons of art and politics, wielding influence equal to ministers. But even their power came at a price. Courtesans were adored when young, discarded when old. They were immortalized in poetry, then abandoned in poverty. Their lives reveal the paradox of medieval sexuality: empowerment and exploitation, luxury and ruin, all bound together. With the witch trials, the church brothels, the humiliating rituals, and the deadly prescriptions, the picture sharpens. Sexuality wasn't a private instinct in the medieval world, it was a system of terror, hypocrisy, and profit. Kings used it to secure dynasties, priests used it to fund cathedrals, communities used it to enforce obedience, and women, always women, bore the brunt of its cruelty. But even now, we haven't opened the deepest chamber, because beneath all the rituals, punishments, and hypocrisies lies the rawest truth of all. Sexuality was never just about bodies. It was about power itself, and in Part 5, we'll confront the final layer of this nightmare: how desire was turned into empire, how intimacy became propaganda, and how the forbidden chambers never truly closed. Desire as empire. The story of medieval and early modern sexuality isn't just about individuals, it's about empires. Kings, sultans, and popes didn't just control land and armies, they controlled desire. The Ottoman Empire built entire bureaucracies around the harem. Thousands of women were enslaved, trained, and displayed as both pleasure and power. Eunuchs, men, castrated in childhood, often dying from the procedure, guarded them, their suffering, the price of imperial control. Every child born of the Sultan's bed carried the potential to reshape dynasties. Europe wasn't different. The French monarchy revolved around the king's virility. Chronicles recorded Louis XIV's mistresses as carefully as his wars. When Henry VIII of England divorced and executed wives, it wasn't because of love, it was because their wombs failed to produce male heirs. Sex shaped politics, bedrooms redrew maps, the economics of flesh. Behind the pageantry was money. Bodies were wealth. In Florence, brothels funded city treasuries. In Avignon, papal coffers filled with sex taxes. In London, prostitutes in Southwark were licensed, fined, and buried in mass graves outside consecrated land. The prophets built cathedrals, paid soldiers, and bought indulgences. In the Islamic caliphates, slave markets sold boys and girls as concubines. Some became powerful, most vanished. Eunuchs were among the most expensive slaves because they symbolized trustworthiness. Mutilated bodies turned into guarantees of loyalty. Desire wasn't just controlled, it was monetized, the body as propaganda. Power wasn't just exercised in bedrooms, it was displayed. Royal portraits emphasized fertility queens painted with swelling gowns, surrounded by children. Kings flaunted mistresses as proof of virility. Court gossip wasn't idle talk, it was policy, shaping reputations, alliances, and even wars. When Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery in 1536, her trial wasn't about her guilt, it was about destroying her politically. The charges incest, witchcraft, promiscuity turned her body into propaganda. Her execution wasn't punishment, it was theatre, a warning that queens were disposable. Similarly, pamphlets during the French Revolution mocked Marie Antoinette as sexually insatiable, accusing her of orgies, lesbianism, and seduction. None of it mattered if it was true. It mattered that her body became a symbol of monarchy's corruption. Sex wasn't private, it was politics. The psychology of obedience. Why did these systems work? Why didn't people revolt against the humiliations, the hypocrisies, the tortures? Because sexuality was the perfect weapon of control. It cut deeper than taxes or whips. It struck at shame, desire, and survival. Fear of exposure kept couples obedient. Fear of infertility kept women desperate. Fear of scandal kept nobles silent. Fear of hell kept peasants submissive. By making sexuality a public, policed, and politicized matter, rulers didn't just control behavior. They controlled souls. The forbidden chamber never closed. And here's the most disturbing truth. The medieval systems may have collapsed, but the logic never disappeared. We no longer have witnessed wedding nights, but we have gossip columns, paparazzi, and tabloids dissecting celebrity sex lives. We no longer burn witches for lust, but women's bodies are still policed, judged, and politicized. Surveillance hasn't vanished. It's gone digital. Our dating apps record desires. Our online lives expose our intimacies. Our scandals explode on global stages. The forbidden chamber is still here. It's just disguised as freedom. So far, we've journeyed through courtrooms where men proved their fitness, royal beds where nations rose and fell, brothels run by bishops, witches tortured for desire, and empires built on enslaved bodies. And yet, one final layer remains, because beneath the politics, the commerce, and the propaganda lies the rawest truth of all, that human beings have always been enslaved to the same needs, desire, control, survival, and that rulers have always twisted those needs into chains. In the final part of this story, we'll strip the last curtain from the forbidden chambers and confront the ultimate question. Was medieval sexuality truly more brutal than ours, or have we just learned to disguise the chains, the last refuge, privacy that never existed? We think of privacy as normal, that the bedroom is ours alone, but in the medieval world, privacy didn't exist. Sheets were inspected for bloodstains, marriages required witnesses, confessions demanded explicit descriptions of desire. Neighbors testified about who entered whose house after dark. Courts kept meticulous records of failures and humiliations. Your body was never yours. It was evidence. This constant exposure wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. Public surveillance of intimacy kept communities cohesive, nobles obedient, and women under control. To live in the medieval world was to live without walls, the theatre of the body. The medieval obsession wasn't just with regulating sex, it was with staging it. Bodies became theatre props. Adulterers paraded in ropes, witches stripped for marks, prostitutes branded and buried in separate cemeteries, noble brides undressed by relatives before being delivered to bed surrounded by nobles. Every act of intimacy became a scene in a grotesque play where shame and power blended. Executioners recorded the screams of adulterers. Priests documented confessions in chilling detail. Physicians wrote manuals that doubled as voyeurism. Even artists painted erotic marginalia in manuscripts, mocking the very rules priests enforced. The medieval body wasn't hidden, it was performed, the cruel genius of control. What made the medieval system terrifying wasn't just its brutality, it was its genius. By controlling sexuality, rulers controlled everything else. Want heirs? Submit to rituals. Want legitimacy? Prove virginity. Want survival? Endure humiliation. Want pleasure? risk damnation, want love, drink poison. Desire was universal, which meant control of desire meant control of everyone. It didn't matter if you were a peasant, a merchant, a queen, or a courtesan. The rules bent, but the chains held. Cracks in the walls. And yet, even in this suffocating system, cracks formed. Some women weaponized their sexuality to rise in power. Mistresses turned into queens, courtesans turned into patrons. Some men mocked the hypocrisy of priests in bawdy songs and plays. Midwives kept knowledge alive despite witch hunts. Lovers carved secret messages into cathedral walls, reminders that desire could never be fully silenced. The system controlled most, but not all, and in those cracks, modern privacy and freedom were born, the ghosts that remain. The medieval world ended, but its ghosts remain. We don't have public consummation, but tabloids dissect celebrity weddings. We don't brand prostitutes, but society still shames women for desire. We don't drown adulterers, but reputations are destroyed in digital public squares. The church no longer runs brothels, but institutions everywhere profit from desire. Surveillance no longer comes from priests and neighbors, but from apps and algorithms. The chamber doors may have changed. The chains are new, but the logic is the same, the final chamber. And so we return to the forbidden chambers one last time. We've walked through the humiliations of courtrooms, the witnessed weddings, the deadly contraceptives, the love potions brewed from corpses, the witch hunts fueled by obsession, the bishops' brothels, the parades of adultery, the harems of sultans, the propaganda of kings, the hypocrisies of popes. Each door revealed another horror. Each ritual showed another way the human body was stolen, judged, and broken. And now the last door closes. The truth of medieval sexuality is simple. It was never about love, never about romance, never about God. It was about power, power to humiliate, power to exploit, power to profit, power to terrify. And that power didn't end with the Middle Ages. It never ends. It only changes form. So, what have we learned, walking through the forbidden chambers? That medieval people weren't prudish saints. They were prisoners in a system where intimacy was public, humiliating, and deadly. That priests preached purity while counting brothel taxes. That women risked death for contraception, men risked ruin in fitness trials, and communities demanded humiliation as entertainment. We've seen how sexuality built empires, destroyed dynasties, and funded cathedrals. We've seen how love potions were brewed from corpses, how witches were condemned for desire, how queens were discarded for failing to conceive. And we've seen how nothing was private. Not your wedding night, not your bed, not your body. That's the truth hidden behind fairy tales of knights and castles, the truth scrubbed from schoolbooks. History isn't romance. History is a crime scene. And the forbidden chambers remind us that the darkest prisons aren't built from stone. They're built from shame, fear, and control. So the next time you hear the word medieval, don't think of chivalry. Think of a courtroom where men were stripped to prove their fitness. Think of a queen forced to bleed on sheets for political legitimacy. Think of a woman swallowing mercury to avoid another pregnancy. That was the Middle Ages. That was intimacy without privacy. That was desire turned into chains. And maybe, just maybe, it's still island.